This is a 1994 Toyota Supra Turbo, and it is a legend, an absolute legend. This car came from the 1990s Japanese sports car era that also included the Mazda RX-7 and the Mitsubishi 3000 GT and the Nissan 300ZX, but this car, the Supra Turbo, has risen above them all to become an icon from this era. Today, I'm going to explain why.
I borrowed this Supra from an entrepreneur friend of mine located here in Orange County, California. He's working on a really cool project that's going to launch soon. Find out more about it at march.com and be sure to follow him on Instagram by clicking the link in the description below. Now, back to the Supra.
This car has only 12,000 miles on it. It has the 6-speed manual transmission that everybody wants, and it has never been modified. This is the most desirable Supra of all, and in this condition, these can sell for huge money, and by that I mean well over $100,000. Yes, $100,000 for a 1994 Toyota. When I grew up, my dad had a 90s Toyota Camry, and you know where that thing is now? Sitting on Craigslist where some guy's offering to trade it for a really nice futon, probably. But the Supra has its reasons for being so valuable. One major reason is this car's movie fame, as the Mark IV Supra Turbo, that's what the cool kids call it, was the hero car in The Fast and the Furious, which is now generally regarded as one of the all-time worst and best car movies in history. Then there's the tunability. The Supra Turbo is famous for its legendary 2JZ engine, which was incredibly tunable, dramatically overbuilt to the point where you can tune it and get well over 1,000 horsepower easily, and a lot of people do. In fact, other cars that use variations of the 2JZ engine are highly sought after by tuners to be harvested for their engine. And it goes beyond just that. The Supra Turbo is frankly just rare, as Toyota just didn't make that many of them compared to the Nissan 300ZX and the Mitsubishi 3000 GT. Part of the reason for that was the cost back when it was new. Back in '94, the MSRP of this thing was around $45,000, which translates to a little over $70,000 in today's money. Imagine paying 70 grand for a Toyota. And then the other problem was most of the people who did opt for the turbo decided to go for the automatic transmission, which makes the manual even rarer. And then there's the styling, another reason this car is so valuable. It's just beautiful. It is a gorgeous car with gorgeous, clean lines. And it's not just a beautiful 1990s car. This is a beautiful car even by modern standards. But whatever the reason, today I'm going to review it. First, I'm going to take you on a tour of the Supra Turbo, and I'm going to show you all of the quirks and features of a legend. Then I'm going to get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'm going to give it a Doug score. Now I'm going to start under the hood where you can take a look at the nicest 2JZ engine you will ever see. Most of these cars have had a ton of miles put on them. They've been heavily modified. Not this one. This is the cleanest 2JZ maybe in existence. Now there are a lot of reasons why this engine is so sought after and so desirable, especially in the tuner scene. It had an iron block for more strength. It had forged rods. There's a bunch of other stuff that I don't normally get into. It was brilliantly covered in a Jalopnik article by David Tracy that I'm going to link in the description below, but suffice it to say this engine was just overbuilt, and so you can throw a ton of horsepower in it. Toyota put 320 horsepower in it and 315 pound-feet of torque, although they claimed it was 276 horsepower thanks to a gentleman's agreement in Japan not to go crazy with horsepower so people might get hurt. But here in the States, it was rated at 320 horsepower, and a lot of people say it was actually even more than that. Now, a couple of interesting items under the hood. One, on the engine itself, you can see it says 2JZ GTE printed there on what has to be the nicest engine cover left on one of these. GTE was the specific engine for the Supra Turbo. I also like the fact that it says on the side, energy conserving 2. Oh no, this is way better than the energy conserving 1. That was nothing compared to all the energy conserving that's going on with the 2. Next up, I want to talk wheels, because this car has some truly hilarious wheels. Now, modern sports cars have aggressive 19, 20, 21-inch wheels with thin spokes to emphasize how angry and sporty they are. This thing was the exact opposite. These tiny, by modern standards, 17-inch wheels, only 5 spokes. They looked so nice. Now, most Mark IV Supra owners get rid of these wheels because they make the car look like a Corolla. But to me, I kind of like them. Yeah, they're not very aggressive, but it's kind of the point of this car. This car was from an era where automakers didn't have to make everything look aggressive and angry in order to get their point across. Nonetheless, they are funny to see today. Our next interesting item is the little model designation on the back that says Supra. Now, it's not unusual for a car to say the model name on the back. Most cars do to identify them. The weird thing to me about this was the font that they chose. It's this like 90s catalog font that you would see in like a travel brochure advertising some city that nobody wants to go to, Cleveland. But anyway, this is the font. It doesn't seem to be really in keeping with the aggressive, angry character of the car. That's what they chose. And you can also see that fun 90s font on the floor mats on the inside of the car and on the brake calipers. No Brembos on this car. Instead, you had Supra. And next up, we got to talk wing. This car has a massive one. A lot of people at the time criticized this wing because it was just so big and it wasn't really in keeping with the car's design, which was otherwise relatively subtle and smooth and simple. But frankly, I love the wing. I think it looks perfect for the Supra now in retrospect. It just makes it look that much more absurd and interesting and unusual. And sometimes I see him driving around without the wing, and frankly, I think it looks naked. Nonetheless, it's probably the only recent Toyota to have like a foot-high wing. The other interesting thing back here is the tail lights, which are very unusual. You can see they have 4 circles, all the same size, that do their various jobs. You have the backup light, the 2 tail lights, which turn into the brake lights, and of course, the turn signals. One interesting thing about these taillights is they were sort of ahead of their time. It became a really cool fad sort of later in the late 90s to have these clear taillights with individual lights inside them. People called them Altezza taillights because they looked like the taillights in the Toyota Altezza, but the Supra had them first. It was ahead of its time. One other thing that I just gotta say about these brake lights, I can't tell you how many times I remember sitting behind this car on a video game screen, playing Gran Turismo and watching these brake lights brake in front of me while I approached a curve on whatever circuit I was on in incredibly low resolution. This was one of the hero cars of that video game, and frankly, of my childhood and everybody's childhood who's about my age. And 2 other interesting lighting-related items in this car. One, around back, I like the fact that Toyota wanted to preserve sort of the clean, uninterrupted look of the rear of this car, and so there's no keyhole anywhere on the bodywork. Instead, Toyota sort of hid the keyhole inside one of the brake light housings, which is over on the passenger side. You stick the key in, twist it, and then the liftgate comes up. Another interesting lighting item is up front. The headlights of this car are gorgeous, and they're not cloudy at all like they are on so many Supras because this car has been driven so little. One interesting item though, take a look in the middle of the headlights. There's like a headlight hump. And when you turn on the headlights, that hump lights up. And then it sort of projects forward very dimly. I don't know if that's the parking light or just a component. I'm not really sure why it's a little hump in the headlight housing, but well, it's there and it looks weird. Never noticed that before. Maybe you haven't either, but now you will see it on all Supras you see at Cars and Coffee. Now, next up we move on to the cargo area, which is accessed by opening up the tailgate. Now, once you're back here, you will find that, first off, there's not really all that much room. The floor of this thing is unusually high, and so if you put like a box back here and it's stuck up to here, when you go to close the tailgate, obviously the glass would kind of smush it down. There's just not all that much room back here. Mostly what's intended to go back here is the roof. Yes, that's right. The roof in this car is removable. They sold them with a full coupe hardtop, but there was also the sport roof, as Toyota called it, which could be removed and then stowed back here in the back. Now, one of the interesting things about the sport roof is the fact that it isn't really all that easy to remove. Now, this isn't how it's portrayed in the Fast and the Furious movie. In one scene, they're in like a car chase and they throw the roof off because they have to jump out the top, and they just do it in like half a second. But actually, it's kind of of a challenging process. And the way it works is there's this little yellow pouch inside the glove box with a tool in it. And you can see the tool says tighten on one side and loosen on the other. Now there are 5 like hex bolts underneath the sport roof, and you have to undo each of them in order to remove the roof, which means it isn't just something you can do while sitting at a stoplight. You have to kind of commit, like, oh, today I'm gonna take off the roof maybe for the season. Now you'll also notice that inside that little yellow pouch there are a couple of plastic like plug looking things. That's because when you remove the roof there are some open and exposed holes with screws in them. You put the little plastic plugs over those holes and it doesn't look as ugly as having exposed screws in your vehicle. Now once you remove it you can put it back here, and you may be wondering, well, how does it go back here? There are some complicated latch looking things. Well, there's an explanation. Stuck here over on one of the little latches is a diagram that shows exactly how you're supposed to put the sport roof in place once you remove it so you can stow it in the back. And it's actually kind of complicated. You have to put that side in first, then the driver's side, then you can do the passenger side, then you do the front part. Now, the owner tells me that having this diagram in place is actually kind of a big deal in the world of Supra Turbo collectors. They want to see it here for originality's sake. Same deal with the little yellow pouch in the glove box that has the tools. A car with the diagram showing how to stow the sport roof and the tools to remove it is considered just a little bit more valuable than a car without those items, which is why you should save everything that comes with your car. The other interesting thing about the cargo area of this car is the fact that you can put the rear seat down for extra room if you want it. You just pull up on this little plastic tab in the middle of the seat, you push it forward, and then you have more space. But again, the load floor is so high that you can't really get all that much in here. But at least it allows you to get a little bit more in here than you could before in case you want to transport something of medium size. Anyway, yes, you heard right just a second ago. This car has back seats, and so it is now time for me to climb into them. The front seat is all the way forward, so you just pull the latch, push the backrest forward, and then you can get in. Obviously, it is rather tight back here, and these are deep bucket seats, so when you get in, you kind of fall down into the seats. Now, when I put the front seat back, I already have no room. If I started to move it back so someone could actually sit here, I would have even less room. There is absolutely zero reason why this car has back seats. Now, because these back seats are so incredibly tiny, there are absolutely no frills back here. Nothing interesting, just basically 2 seats and a couple of seat belts. There is, however, one interesting item, and that would be the floor mat back here. It has one of the smallest floor mats I've ever seen in a car. Why bother even including a floor mat for the rear seats you know will never be used? I have no idea, but Toyota did. Next up, we move on to the front seats in the Supra Turbo. There are quite a few interesting items, starting with the cockpit arrangement in this car. Everything is angled towards the driver in this clever sort of upside down U shape. Everything is sort of intended for the driver to be able to reach it most easily. That's the whole point of this car, to be driven. And the U shape even continues over onto the door panel where the power windows and the lock switch are also angled towards the driver. This car is driver focused, and you notice that the moment you first step inside. Next, I'm going through some of the interesting items in this cockpit. One of the things I like the most is the climate vents, the driver's side ones anyway. They're circular and you can move them around and adjust them to your liking, but the thing I like best is when you go to close them, they don't just close with one little sheet of plastic. Instead, these like fan blade looking things behind the climate vent kind of all move into position to close them off. It is a very cool look. Now, as for the climate controls themselves, they're a lot simpler and easier than what you'd find on basically any other exciting sports car. These are mainly Toyota climate controls, but I especially like the climate control dials. There's one on the top that changes the temperature, but then I especially like the one that changes the airflow. You can see that as you turn it, this little light kind of jumps to additional airflow amounts with each turn you give it, which is a kind of satisfying feeling. Next up, moving below the climate controls, this car has a radio, obviously, the cassette player, but it also has a CD player, which would have been a huge deal back in 1994. People were buying cars as late as the late 90s and not getting CD players. That is a pretty big deal, but then again, this was a pretty expensive car, so it makes sense that it had it. Next up, one item I like below the radio is the fact that the traction control off button is like in the middle of the center control stack and massive. I think Toyota knew exactly what was going to be happening when they sold this car to people, so they made that button very easy to find. And next to the traction control off button, you have the gear lever, which is kind of cool. It's in this little little circular housing. But the thing I like most about it is the fact that it has this cool baseball stitching on top, which looks very nice. Even to this day, I wish more automakers would do that with manual transmission shift knobs. Next up, we move on to the center console, which is of course in the middle, and it has some storage just like it does in so many other cars. Now, the interesting thing about this center console is the fact that it opens only towards the driver. The passenger can't use it. It continues the sort of driver-centric theme of this car. The passenger doesn't even have access to storage in the center console. Now, when you open up the center console, you are greeted by a long, detailed group of warning labels. The one on the bottom goes through the entire process of installing and removing the sport roof, sort of line by line what you have to do. Again, it wasn't as easy as they showed in the Fast and the Furious. But the warning label above that is more interesting to me. It talks about how to deal with the engine and the engine oil on a turbocharged vehicle such as this one. Specifically, it says a couple of rather amusing things. One is, make sure to change engine oil according to owner's manual. Do not stop engine immediately after high-speed driving or pulling trailers. So if you're taking your horse trailer out in your Supra Turbo and you get to the stables, don't just turn it off. Let it idle for a while to sort of cool down, as per this warning label. Next up, moving on to the gauge cluster, a couple of interesting and unusual items. One is the fact that the odometer is not located in the gauge cluster like in virtually every other car, especially Toyotas from this era. Instead, it's over to the right of the gauge cluster, above the center control stack. That's where it reads how many miles you've traveled, which is unusual. Also unusual in the gauge cluster is the fact that there is this little warning triangle that tells you if something is amiss. This triangle comes on when you don't have your seatbelt buckled. It comes on when a door is open, when the parking brake is on. Anytime you see the triangle, you know something's going on. Also interesting in the vicinity of the gauge cluster is just how much stuff up here is borrowed from regular Toyota vehicles. This steering wheel, for instance, comes right off the Camry, the Corolla, the 4Runner from this area. Same goes with the turn signal stalk, the wiper stalk, the power window switches. It fits in with Toyota's philosophy. Why make 3 buttons? As I mentioned in a prior video, why make a different item when you already have one that works just fine? So you have a steering wheel that doesn't really fit in with the character of the Supra, but it works, so why bother to change it? Unfortunately, this also meant that the Supra gets the puny Toyota Camry sounding horn. Take a listen. Next up, moving on to the glove box in the Supra, you will find in this car the original 1994 Toyota Supra owner's manual. Now, I love to leaf through the owner's manuals in these older cars and see what the automakers were telling us, and one perfect example of that is on the inside cover of this owner's manual. It says, "We really care about you. Please buckle up. Toyota has made a special effort to encourage the use of seat belts," and then it goes on to say Toyota belts are comfortable, easy to use, and convenient, as opposed to those damn Honda belts that were uncomfortable and difficult to use. Another interesting item in this thing is on page 106. It says, "Caution, never turn off the engine to coast down hills." Well, duh. Your power steering and brake booster will not function without the engine running. Also, the emission control system operates properly only when the engine is running. So, if you turn off your engine to coast down a hill, you won't have brakes, you won't have steering, and also, you won't have emissions. Who cares? You're gonna die. Who cares about the emissions? But Toyota puts that in there anyway, just to guilt you into not turning off your engine in case the threat of death isn't enough. And so those are the quirks and features of the Mark IV Supra Turbo. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the Supra Turbo. I've always wanted to do this, never have. All right, going on a highway on-ramp here. The car is exceptionally well balanced, feels very, very planted. And now I'm flooring it. Wow. Okay, couple things. Going around the highway on-ramp, the car feels really, really well balanced, like a Porsche or something like that. Much better than I associate with any Japanese car. That was surprising. In terms of accelerating there, acceleration is okay, not amazing, 320 horsepower. Back in the day, I think this would have been really, really impressive, but to me now, having driven so many other fast cars, and with cars kind of becoming faster, it's not quite as impressive. One interesting thing is how mechanical the shifter and clutch feels. it does not feel incredibly smooth. It is easy to drive, but not exceptionally smooth. You can kind of feel it clunk a little bit as you shift into gear and go through the gears, and I'm surprised by that. Porsches, BMWs are more buttery smooth, and this car is more mechanical, for better or worse. I do like the fact that I feel like I could really go hard in this car because I know this motor can take a lot of abuse. It was so famous for how overbuilt it was and how much power it could take. It can easily handle stock driving. The handling in this car is really impressive. The steering is a little bit lazy, but it's very direct. But the handling is what really impresses me. The car is just so vastly stable and capable of going hard around a corner. It feels very planted, very stable on the ground. The steering could be a little bit more direct, but it's still a ton of fun to throw around. Dropping gear in Florida on the highway, it just doesn't feel like it's got that much give. There's not that much power that this car delivers. The owner told me, bolt-on mods, you can get another 150 horsepower out of this thing in 2 seconds, no problem. But it's also, to me, nice to review this car and experience it how it was when Toyota initially sold this car back in the day, and I find that to be super cool. Either way, I will say this car behaves like an old school turbo car when you think about acceleration. 0 to 60, 4.6, pretty good, but that's only because you're getting into the boost. And when you get into the boost, when you hit 4,000, 5,000 RPM, it feels like about the fastest car in the world. From 1,000 to 4, you're like, well, this is not so great. And then turbos kick in and this thing just flies. Ultimately, though, this car is just an icon. The driving experience is good. It's fast. It feels very, very fast at low speeds. It's okay on the highway. But you know, you're driving a stick shift back to basics car that was just an icon of this era. Not only from the movie, but also just all of the 90s Japanese cars. This one and the NSX are the ones that stand out as just the ultimate. And it's hard not to smile when you're driving this car. Yeah, it's not as fast as a lot of modern sporty cars, but man, this thing is just cool. It's so cool and so exciting and so thrilling to just think to yourself, I'm driving a Mark IV Supra Turbo. You know, you're just, everybody else on the road, even if you're passing somebody in a McLaren, you know your car is maybe not faster, maybe not better, but more special. And so that's the 1994 Toyota Supra Turbo, the Mark IV Supra Turbo. This car is a legend, and it doesn't matter if it's because of its styling, or its rarity, or its engine, or its Fast and the Furious fame. It doesn't matter why. This car is legendary, iconic, and it is only going to keep getting more valuable in the future. And now it's time to give it a Doug score.
Starting with the weekend categories and styling, I think the Supra is beautiful, simple, handsome, starting to get a little dated, but it's still great, and it gets an 8 out of 10. Acceleration 0 to 60 is 4.6 seconds, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Handling is okay, steering is a bit vague, and handling could be a little sharper, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Fun factor is good. It's a fun car, though not insanely fast or tossable by modern standards, though you do get some fun just knowing you're in a Mark IV Supra Turbo, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Finally, cool factor. These are really special, and they'll still draw a crowd at Cars and Coffee, and it gets a 7 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 33 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features. The Supra had a lot of stuff for its time, but it's getting old now, and it just has the basics, and it gets a 2 out of 10. Comfort is average, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Quality is good. The Supra isn't full of ultra high quality materials, but it's exceptionally reliable, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Practicality is only okay. It has 4 seats, but a small cargo area, and it gets a 3 out of 10. Finally, value. It's hard to imagine paying $100 grand for a used Toyota, even for a Supra, so you'd think the value score would be low, but these are still going up in value, and even though the market has softened a little bit, it earns a 7 out of 10 for a total daily score of 24 out of 50. Added up, and the Doug score is 57 out of 100, which places it here among rivals from the period. Yes, it's better than the NSX. Though the NSX is way better in the weekend categories, the Supra has a higher daily score and just edges it out. The Supra is also better than all the other 1990s Japanese sports car competition, which is reflected in the Supra's market value. Happy Doug-cember, everyone.